In this lesson, looking at AQA A-level history, we are going to continue talking about the period of reform and challenge between 1851 and 1886, and we're going to think about economic developments in this lesson, focusing specifically, as the AQA specification requires, on things relating to the development of agriculture, trade and industry, economic ideologies, the idea of the boom and workshop of the world theory concerning Great Britain, as well as the way in which the economy looks at the onset of depression. So beginning first then, let's have a look at agricultural developments. And we can see that sort of circa 1851 to circa 1886, so the mid-19th century, agriculture was still a very dominant sector within the British economy. Its importance, however, was beginning to decline as the result of the relative rise in industrialization. And that makes a lot of sense. Industrialization and the Industrial Revolution is in full swing at this point, is continuing to become more and more impactful and expansive. And so, as a result of that, agriculture is going to become to decline in terms of its economic importance. Now, the impact of earlier agricultural reforms, such as the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement was the consolidation of common land into private estates, and the development of new farming techniques, such as that of crop rotation and selective breeding, continues into the second half of the 19th century. So those are ideas and principles that we see coming into effect in the later half of the 18th century and at least the early half of the 19th century. But their benefits will continue to develop as time goes on throughout the 19th century. By the mid-19th century, though, we see that there is the growth in competition. So British agriculture begins to face increasing competition from cheaper foreign imports. These are imports particularly from countries like the United States, Canada, and in fact Argentina. The price of foodstuffs like wheat and grain began to fall, and British farmers begin to struggle to compete relative to these imports, and this is especially in light of rising costs. By the 1870s, the sector itself enters what is referred to as an agricultural depression. This is where we see that wages are quite low and that many farmers are facing financial difficulties. A series of poor harvests in the 1870s will continue to exacerbate this situation, leading to widespread hardship in these rural areas. This was a period of agricultural decline, and it had lasting effects on the rural population, including the leading to an increased urban migration as people sought work in the rapidly growing industrial centres. On the other hand, then, we have the Industrial Revolution and we have industry. And so by the mid-1850s, Britain had firmly established itself as a world leader in terms of industrial output. The Industrial Revolution that began in the late 18th century was well underway as we go into the mid-19th century, and it brings profound changes to the economy. Firstly, through things like textiles and heavy industry, we see that the manufacturing of things like cotton and wool becomes the backbone of the British industrial economy. Industrialization of textile production, combined with improvements in steam power and mechanization, begins to help Britain maintain its position in the world as a leading exporter of manufactured goods. Additionally, industries like iron and steel was growing at an industrial rate. The Bessemer process, which was introduced in the 1850s, would revolutionize steel production, making it cheaper and more efficient. This was an innovation that gave Britain a global competitive advantage over building infrastructure such as railways, bridges, and ships. Speaking of which, one of the most remarkable developments was the expansion of the railway system. By the 1850s, specifically, railway networks had expanded rapidly with the linking of towns and cities across the country. Railways were vital for transporting raw materials such as coal and iron to factories and shipping manufactured goods out to global markets. The British economy then became transport-oriented, with railways playing a key role in the connecting of this domestic and global trade. As time goes on, then urbanization begins to accompany the industrialization process, and urbanization becomes unprecedented. We see cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and Liverpool growing at a rapid rate, becoming industrial hubs that attracted workers from rural areas. The movement of people from the countryside to urban centres was a major economic development, though it led to challenges relating to housing, sanitation, and social conditions. By the mid-19th century, then, Britain is often referred to, and the empire is often referred to, as the sort of workshop of the world. And this is because it produced an overwhelming share of the world's industrial output. Exports of manufactured goods, particularly textiles, machinery, and steel, would help to fuel economic growth. Britain dominated global trade, especially in its colonies and with other industrializing nations. British capitalists, often investing in foreign markets, would finance railways, ports, infrastructure projects across the entirety of the global empire. Britain's economy was then heavily reliant on this idea of international trade. The country maintained free trade policies, which were institutionalized with the repeal of what were known as the Corn Laws in 1846. Essentially, slightly before the period that you need to study in this series. But essentially, the Corn Laws opened up British markets to cheap agricultural imports, which lowered food prices and benefits consumers on a general scale. Now, simultaneously, Britain would rely on exports of manufactured goods, as well as capital to its empire and beyond. British merchants dominated global shipping, and transporting goods to and from the colonies across the world was one of the major factors in the growth of this economic prosperity. The idea of the country's naval superiority would also ensure that there was equal and easy access to vital trading routes. The rapid expansion and industrialization were accompanied by the rise of new economic ideologies, many of which sought to explain or reform the social and economic consequences of industrial capitalism. So we can see that the rise of classical liberalism, theories which were championed by figures like Adam Smith in the 18th century, continued to dominate British economic thought throughout the 19th century. You see that classical liberals essentially emphasize the importance of things such as free markets, competition, and the limited role of government in economic affairs. The ideology was influential in shaping Britain's free trade policies and its global economic dominance that was enjoyed for much of the mid-19th century. We see that classical liberal thinkers such as philosopher John Stuart Mill and economist David Ricardo argue for a variety of different theories which benefits to free trade. For example, the law of comparative advantage. This is essentially the principle that where you have two countries, that one is good at producing one type of good, the other is good at producing the other type of good, it makes more sense, it makes the most sense for each of those countries to focus all of their modes and means of production on their easiest product, on the products that is the easiest for them to produce, and to trade those rather than having both countries create both sets of goods. So let's say country A is really good at making cars and country B is really good at making planes. Rather than having both country A and country B making both cars and planes, country A, who's really good at making cars, will just make lots and lots and lots and lots of cars. They will make more than they need. And country B, that's really good at making planes, will make lots of planes, more than they need. And then they can just trade the cars and the planes between each other. This is known as comparative advantage. Figures like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill advocated for philosophical theories such as that of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism aims to maximize the overall happiness within society. And so while utilitarianism had significant influence on social and political policy, such as the passage of reforms that attempt to improve public health and education, it can also be seen as being imbued in some of the roles in economics thoughts, so particularly when thinking about the policy towards the working class. And then extending even further beyond utilitarianism, we can see the growth of socialism and labour movements. As these economic disparities between the wealthy industrialists and the working class began to grow, socialist ideologies begin to gain traction. You have figures like Karl Marx, although his influence in Britain was relatively limited during this period, and people like Robert Owen promoting ideas of collective ownership and worker rights. Karl Marx won't become popular until later and later on into the sort of the early 20th century, should I say. But more broadly, the growth of the trade union movement during this period was a response to the harsh conditions that were faced by industrial workers. And so, including things like long hours, low wages, and unsafe working environments, we can see how such movements and socialist movements and labour movements begin to gain traction. Let's finish off then by spending a little bit of time focusing specifically on the idea of Britain as being the workshop of the world, something I mentioned earlier on, and then also the onset of the Depression. Well, the idea of Britain being the workshop of the world was this idea that relates to the experience in the mid-19th century of rapid industrial growth, technological innovation, and expanding global markets. The phrase workshop of the world referred to Britain's unrivaled industrial output and global economic dominance. British industries, particularly concerning textiles, coal, steel, and iron, were leaders in production and export, and in the country itself enjoyed almost monopolistic hold over key markets for much of the century. Essentially, a monopoly is where you have, let's say you have a market, let's say you have the social media market where you have lots of different social media companies. Let's say one particularly rich individual tries to buy up and purchase all of these social media companies. Let's say they purchase Facebook, they purchase Instagram and Meta, and they purchase Twitter, and they purchase TikTok, Truth Social, YouTube, all these different things. That means that that one company or that one person has 100% control over an entire market, the social media market. This is what is known as a monopoly. And monopolies aren't really very good. They're very good for the people that are owners of the monopoly, but they're not really good for competition because nobody else can compete. You can have, alternatively, a situation where you have many quite very big, so I say actually more specifically, when you have 2 or 3 very big companies that control all of the market themselves collectively. This is sometimes known as an oligopoly. It's a slightly lesser form of monopolistic behaviour. And so Britain during this time was able to enjoy almost entirely monopolistic hold over a number of very key markets during this period. Britain's economic supremacy was not just about its scale of production, but it was also about its technological leadership. Britain developed the most advanced machineries, the most advanced factory systems, allowing them to maintain a competitive edge. And in addition to this, the railroads, the steamships, and the other innovations enabled British manufacturers to move goods and raw materials more efficiently than their competitors. And so the prosperity of the mid-19th century was obviously very important, but you have to think about the onset of the Depression. The onset of the Depression starts to take place in the 1870s and the 1880s. The global economic environment begins to shift. There are several key factors that contribute to the onset of the Depression in the late 19th century. The first of these is the declining in agriculture. The agricultural depression, as mentioned earlier, was triggered by the competition from cheap imported grains and the cost of new machinery. This leads to a stagnation in agricultural output. The result is that the farmers had an inability to compete with the imports that further contributes ultimately to economic stagnation in the rural areas. Industrialization then in other countries, particularly in Germany and the United States, begins to pose an increasing amount of competition to the British industries. While the British had almost complete control over the industrialization process for much of the early 1800s going into the mid-1800s, as countries start to catch up, their hold on industry begins to wane. These countries would start to adopt new technologies and production methods, which all allows them to compete more effectively in global markets and reduces Britain's dominance in manufacturing. The expansion of industrial production, especially in textile and iron industries, eventually leads to what we call overproduction, the overproduction of these items. The result of overproducing, of essentially flooding a market with a great amount of supply, is that it reduces the amount of price. The prices start to fall, and this leads to a stagnation in some industrial sectors, particularly in the 1880s. And then finally, we have economic depression leading to worsening conditions for the working class, lower wages and fewer job opportunities. And so while we will talk about the depression that we start to see when we look specifically at topic number 2, the Great Depression and its aftermath, because that concerns more the 1880s and beyond, the onset of the Depression can be seen. We can see that essentially during this period there are a number of factors which will contribute to the eventual depression that appears later on in time.